In the theater of modern politics, where volume is mistaken for virtue and outrage is the currency of the realm, Senator John Kennedy was an anachronism, a relic from a forgotten time when words were weighed before they were spoken, and silence was a weapon, not a weakness. He sat at the witness table, a portrait of Southern stoicism, his stillness a stark contrast to the tempest of fury being unleashed upon him. The air in the House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing room was thick with a manufactured electricity, a current of progressive indignation directed entirely at him. Across from him, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar was in her element, a conductor of chaos, her voice a symphony of righteous accusation. She believed she was writing the final chapter of his career. She had no idea he was about to write the epilogue of hers. "Senator Kennedy," she declared, her words sharp and aimed to wound, "you are a living monument to a past America is desperately trying to forget. A past of closed doors and closed minds, where men who look and sound like you decide who gets to be an American." Her supporters, a carefully curated audience of activists who had lined up in the pre-dawn chill, roared their approval. The room was a sea of phone screens held aloft, each one recording the public execution of a Louisiana senator. The press corps, smelling blood in the water, typed furiously, their headlines already taking shape. "Omar eviscerates Kennedy. The Old South meets the New America." They were all witnesses to a great battle, but they were watching the wrong fighter. Kennedy remained impassive, his gaze steady, his hands resting calmly on the table. To the untrained eye, he looked like a man cornered, a grandfather enduring a tirade. But to those who understood the subtle art of power, a different story was unfolding. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played at the edges of his lips, the quiet confidence of a chess master who sees the board not just 2 moves ahead, but 10. He was not absorbing the attack. He was studying it, dissecting it, allowing his opponent to exhaust herself in a flurry of blows that never landed. "You speak of struggle," Omar continued, her voice rising, a crescendo of performative passion. "But what does a man like you know of real struggle? Have you ever fled a war-torn land with nothing but the clothes on your back? Have you ever felt the sting of suspicion in the eyes of your new neighbors? Have you ever had to fight for the very right to exist in a nation that sees your faith, your skin, your very presence as a threat?" She paused, letting the weight of her questions hang in the air, a cloud of moral superiority. The silence was her ally, a moment for the room to absorb the indictment. She expected a flustered defense, a sputtering denial, perhaps a clumsy attempt to justify his record. She was not prepared for the gentle, almost paternal warmth that met her gaze. Kennedy leaned forward slightly, his pale blue eyes locking onto hers. "Thank you, Congresswoman, for your heartfelt words," he began, his Louisiana drawl as smooth and slow as molasses, each syllable dripping with a disarming courtesy that immediately lowered the temperature in the room. "You paint a powerful picture of the refugee's journey, a journey of hardship and resilience." He paused, letting the compliment land, a small offering of peace before the declaration of war. "And since you've raised the subject of personal journeys and the challenges of building a new life in this great country, perhaps it would be instructive for the committee to examine your own remarkable story in greater detail." With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached for a simple, almost comically mundane manila folder that had been sitting before him, untouched and unnoticed. As his fingers opened the clasp, a sudden, profound quiet fell over the room. The buzzing of the crowd ceased. The frantic typing of the reporters stopped. Every eye was fixed on that folder, an object that had suddenly transformed from a piece of stationery into a vessel of impending doom. "You speak of building a life from nothing," Kennedy said, his voice still soft, conversational. He slid a single document from the folder. "Let's begin with how you started building yours. Let's talk about the year 2009 and a marriage license issued by the state of Minnesota." Omar's posture, so confident just moments before, stiffened. A flicker of uncertainty, a shadow of alarm crossed her face. "My private life is irrelevant to this hearing," she snapped, a hint of desperation creeping into her voice. "Oh, but it is profoundly relevant, ma'am," Kennedy countered, his tone hardening just enough to cut through her defense. "It is relevant when questions of law are involved. You see, this marriage license bears the name of one Ahmed Nursaid Elmi." He let the name hang in the air, a single, sharp note in the silent room. He looked down at the paper, then back up at her, his expression one of polite inquiry. "Your brother." The word detonated in the chamber. A wave of shock and confusion washed over the room. Omar's supporters, who had been cheering her every word, were stunned into silence, their signs drooping. Her Democratic colleagues on the committee exchanged panicked, bewildered glances. The carefully constructed narrative of the day, the story of a progressive hero confronting a relic of the past, had just been shattered into a million pieces. The hunter, caught in a snare she hadn't even seen, could only stare, her face a mask of frozen disbelief. The fox had bared its teeth. Smash that like button and subscribe, because the reckoning was just beginning. The accusation hung in the air, thick and heavy, sucking the oxygen from the room. "That is a vile, racist lie," Omar finally managed, her voice trembling with a rage that felt less like righteous indignation and more like raw, cornered fear. "It's a discredited conspiracy theory peddled by right-wing extremists." Her words, which moments before had commanded the room, now seemed hollow, a desperate incantation against a truth that was rapidly closing in. Kennedy listened with the patience of a man who had anticipated this exact denial. "Discredited, you say?" he asked, his tone one of genuine curiosity. He reached back into his folder, the source of what was quickly becoming Omar's personal apocalypse. "Well, let's examine the evidence together, shall we? Facts, after all, are stubborn things. They are not racist, ma'am. They are simply true." He produced a new set of documents, his movements unhurried, each paper laid out with the precision of a surgeon arranging his instruments. "Let's establish a timeline for clarity's sake. In 2002, you entered into a traditional Islamic marriage with a man named Ahmed Hiasi. You had 2 children together. Is that correct?" Omar nodded curtly, her jaw clenched. "Yes. But you did not legally marry Mr. Hiasi at that time," Kennedy continued, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "Then in 2008, you state that you and Mr. Hiasi separated, and just 1 year later in 2009, you entered into a legal, state-sanctioned marriage with Mr. Ahmed Nursed Elmi. The man you claim is not your brother." He paused, looking up at the committee members, a teacher ensuring his students were following the lesson. "Now this is where the story becomes peculiar." He slid another document into the light. "This, ma'am, is a copy of the lease agreement for your residence in Columbia Heights, Minnesota for the years 2010 and 2011. It lists 3 adult occupants, yourself, Mr. Hiasi, the father of your children from whom you were supposedly separated, and Mr. Elmi, your new legal husband." He let the implications settle. A few nervous coughs broke the silence. "Now I'm just a simple man from the bayous of Louisiana," Kennedy drawled, a hint of theatrical folksiness in his voice. "But even I know that's an unconventional living arrangement. A woman, her new husband, and her old partner all sharing a home. It's the sort of thing that makes you wonder." The tension in the room was palpable, a physical presence. Omar's attorneys whispered frantically in her ear, but she sat rigid, a statue of defiance beginning to crack. "But the living situation is just the beginning," Kennedy said, his voice sharpening again. "Let's talk about why this marriage was so convenient. I have here Mr. Elmi's application to North Dakota State University." He produced the document, its official letterhead clearly visible. "He was admitted as a student, and because he was married to you, a legal resident, he was granted certain privileges. Privileges that allowed him to remain in the United States and build his own American dream." Omar found her voice. "This is circumstantial. You are twisting facts to create a narrative." "Am I?" Kennedy's smile was thin and dangerous. "Then let's move on to something less circumstantial. The internet is a fascinating place, isn't it? It remembers things we wish it would forget." He held up a large, clear printout of a social media post. "This is from Mr. Elmi's Instagram account, dated 2013. It's a picture of your own daughter. The caption reads, 'Hanging out with my favorite niece today.' Niece, ma'am, not stepdaughter. It's a curious choice of words for a man who is supposedly married to the girl's mother, wouldn't you agree?" The silence from Omar's side of the room was absolute. The activists who had come to cheer her on were now staring at their phones, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Some began to quietly gather their belongings, inching toward the exits, not wanting to be associated with the disaster that was unfolding. "But perhaps that was just a translation error," Kennedy continued, the sarcasm barely veiled. "So let's look at something that doesn't require translation. He produced another set of official-looking papers, these bearing the crest of the United Kingdom's government. These are Mr. Elmy's high school records from London. They list his father's name as Nursaid Elmy. Now, let's compare that to your own refugee application documents from when you first came to America. He laid a second document beside the first. Your father's name is listed as Nursaid Elmy. Now, ma'am, he said, looking at her with an expression of mock bewilderment, this could be one of the most extraordinary coincidences in the history of human migration. Or, the simpler explanation is that you share the same father. Which is it? My father's name was common, and it was changed, she shot back, her voice strained. A perfectly reasonable explanation, Kennedy conceded smoothly, which is why my staff took the liberty of seeking clarification from people who would know best. He gestured to a stack of papers. These are sworn affidavits, signed under penalty of perjury, from 6 respected elders in the Minneapolis Somali community, people who knew your family back in Somalia. They all state unequivocally that Ahmed Nursaid Elmy is your younger brother. One of them, a woman named Fatima Hassan, describes playing with you and your brother in the camps. Her statement is remarkably detailed. The room felt like a courtroom during a sentencing. The weight of the evidence was becoming crushing. Kennedy, however, was saving the most damning piece for last. His voice dropped, becoming graver, more serious. But now, ma'am, we come to the smoking gun. Pulled out a single printed email, its header indicating it was from a government server, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request. This is an email from Mr. Elmy to you, dated 2011. You believed it was deleted. It was not. He began to read, his voice clear and steady. Thank you for all your help with the papers, sister. I will pay you back as soon as I can. From Mr. Elmy to you. And your reply. You don't need to pay me back. That's what family is for. Just be careful and make sure you delete this. A collective gasp swept through the room. A prominent Democrat on the committee was heard muttering, "Oh my God," into a hot microphone. Kennedy repeated the key phrase slowly, letting it sink in. Thank you for all your help with the papers, sister. Not wife, sister. And your reply, that's what family is for. That seems quite clear, doesn't it, Congresswoman? Omar's face had gone from pale to ashen. The carefully constructed world of Ilhan Omar, the progressive icon, the refugee success story, was being systematically demolished. Brick by brick, lie by lie, right before the eyes of the world. That email is a fabrication, Omar whispered, the words barely audible. It was the last desperate defense of a person drowning in a sea of irrefutable proof. A forgery. Kennedy looked at her, not with anger but with something that resembled pity. Forged by whom, ma'am? By the United States Department of State, because that is the source of this document, retrieved from official government servers, authenticated, and provided to this committee under the full force of federal law. He let the weight of that statement settle, the sheer impossibility of her claim hanging in the air. He then seamlessly pivoted to the next layer of the deception, demonstrating how one crime had bled into another. But let's set aside the immigration fraud for a moment and discuss the financial consequences of this arrangement. While you were legally married to your brother, Mr. Elmy, you were also, it seems, reconciling with your previous partner, Mr. Hiesi. He produced a new set of documents, holding them up for the committee to see. I have here your federal tax returns for the years 2014 and 2015. On these forms, which you signed under penalty of perjury, you claim the status of married filing jointly. The man you claimed as your spouse on these returns was not Mr. Elmy, your legal husband. It was Mr. Hiesi. The room, already stunned, descended into a new level of shocked silence. This was no longer a complex family drama. It was clear, straightforward financial fraud, a crime understood by every tax-paying citizen. Let me be clear for the record, Kennedy continued, his voice a sharp instrument of precision. You filed joint tax returns with a man to whom you were not legally married, thereby gaining tax advantages you were not entitled to, all while you were legally married to another man, your brother. That, ma'am, is a textbook definition of tax fraud, a federal offense. He noted her attempt to interject and preempted it. I know you have since filed amended returns, but you did so only after investigative journalists began exposing these discrepancies. Correcting a crime after you've been caught does not erase the crime itself. It is merely an admission of guilt. And I have here, he added, pulling one more paper from the seemingly bottomless folder, A memo from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. They have opened a formal inquiry into these returns. It seems they are particularly interested in how you could make such a fundamental error for 2 consecutive years. 3 Democratic members of the committee, who had been shifting uncomfortably in their seats, now stood up and walked out of the hearing room without a word. The exodus had begun. The political rats were fleeing a sinking ship. Kennedy paused, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. He looked at Omar, his expression turning from one of a prosecutor to that of a disappointed moral arbiter. But what I find most troubling, Congresswoman, is not just the crimes themselves. Immigration fraud and tax fraud are serious felonies, to be sure. It is the pattern of deception. It is the fact that when journalists, investigators, and concerned citizens began to ask legitimate questions based on public records, your response was not to provide clarity. It was to attack. You branded them as racists. You accused them of Islamophobia. You wrapped yourself in the flag of your identity, using it as a shield to deflect from the truth. He gestured to the mountain of evidence on the table. Marriage fraud to secure citizenship for a family member. Tax fraud to illegally reduce your financial obligations. And then, when exposed, you deployed the most toxic, divisive accusations possible to silence your critics. Is this the American way, Congresswoman? Is this the integrity you promised your constituents? Omar's chief of staff was now leaning over, whispering urgently in her ear, his face pale with panic. The advice was obvious to everyone in the room. Plead the fifth, stop talking, but it was too late. The damage was done. I believe I need to consult with my legal counsel, Omar stammered, her voice a fragile thread. Of course, Kennedy said, his magnanimity making the moment even more brutal. By all means, consult your attorneys. But before you take a break, you and your counsel should understand that we are just getting warmed up. He reached for a new, thicker section of his folder, this one clearly labeled in bold typescript, Campaign Finance, E Street Group. When we return, he announced to the room, we will discuss your financial relationship with Mr. Timothy Minot. We will explore how hundreds of thousands of dollars from your campaign donors ended up in his company's bank account while you were engaged in an extramarital affair with him. The story of your corruption is only just beginning. He smiled that same gentle Southern smile, a smile that had, over the course of an hour, become an omen of total destruction. Perhaps we should take a 10-minute recess. I imagine some of my colleagues across the aisle might want to make a few phone calls, maybe to the DNC. Maybe to their own donors, to explain why they stood by you for so long. The committee chairman, a Democrat who looked as though he had aged a decade in the last hour, weakly banged his gavel, calling for the recess. As the room began to clear, Kennedy sat calmly, methodically organizing his papers for the next round. The personal destruction was complete. The financial destruction was about to begin. When the committee reconvened, the landscape of the room had been irrevocably altered. Several chairs on the Democratic side remained glaringly empty, their former occupants having chosen self-preservation over party loyalty. Ilhan Omar returned to her seat, no longer the confident accuser but a defendant flanked by a pair of grim-faced attorneys. The air of defiance she had clung to was gone, replaced by the brittle, haunted look of someone who knows the executioner is merely sharpening his axe for the final blow. Kennedy, by contrast, appeared rejuvenated by the brief respite. He waited with the serene patience of a predator who has already crippled its prey and is simply enjoying the final moments of the hunt. Once the formalities were concluded, he opened the new section of his folder. "Welcome back, Congresswoman," he began, his tone polite but devoid of its earlier warmth. "Let us now turn our attention to your campaign finances. Specifically, your relationship with a political consultant named Mr. Timothy Minot and his firm, the E Street Group." At the mention of the name, Omar's lawyers visibly stiffened. One leaned in to whisper, but she waved him away with a flick of her wrist, a final, futile gesture of control. "According to public filings with the Federal Election Commission," Kennedy continued, his voice steady and clear, "from 2018 through 2019, your campaign committee, Ilhan for Congress, disbursed payments totaling more than $350,000 to Mr. Minot's company. During this exact same period, you were engaged in an extramarital affair with Mr. Minot. Is that a correct statement of fact? My personal life has no bearing on." She began, the automatic, reflexive defense of a politician. It has every bearing when you use campaign funds donated by the public to facilitate it. Kennedy cut in, his voice sharp as glass. But you need not take my word for it. Let's hear from someone with a more intimate knowledge of the situation. He produced a thick, bound document. This is the sworn deposition of Dr. Bate Minot, Mr. Minot's former wife, given under oath during their divorce proceedings in the Superior Court of the District of Columbia. Her testimony is quite illuminating. Without waiting for an objection that he knew would be useless, he began to read. My husband, Tim, confessed to me in April of 2019 that he was in love with Congresswoman Omar and was ending our marriage to be with her. He admitted their affair had been going on for some time. When I questioned him about his constant travel with her, he told me, and I quote, "Don't worry about the cost. Ilhan's campaign is paying for all of it." The room, which had been murmuring with anticipation, fell into a profound hush. The reporters leaned forward, their fingers poised over their keyboards, capturing every damning word. Ilhan's campaign is paying for all of it, Kennedy repeated, letting the phrase echo in the silent chamber. That's a rather blunt admission, isn't it? But perhaps Dr. Minot was merely a scorned woman seeking revenge. He paused, then produced another stack of papers. Except her testimony is corroborated by the receipts. He held up a credit card statement, the Omar for Congress name clearly visible at the top. Here we have a romantic dinner for two at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Paris, billed to your campaign. Here is a charge for a luxurious hotel suite in California's wine country, with a king-sized bed during a weekend when no campaign events were scheduled, paid for by your donors. Here are airline tickets, first class, for you and Mr. Minot to travel to destinations where your only official business was a brief photo opportunity, followed by days of unaccounted for time. Those were legitimate consulting expenses, Omar protested, her voice thin and unconvincing. Were they? Kennedy countered, pulling out his phone and connecting it to the room's audio system. Then perhaps you can explain this. This is a voice message left by Mr. Minot for his wife, obtained legally during the divorce discovery process. A man's voice, arrogant and dismissive, filled the room. Bate, stop harassing me about the money. I told you Ilhan's campaign is footing the bill for everything right now. You'll get your settlement when this is all over. Just be patient. A collective gasp went through the gallery. One of Omar's own aides, a young woman who had looked up to her, slowly put her head in her hands, unable to watch any longer. Footing the bill for everything, Kennedy said, turning off the recording. That is not the language of legitimate political consulting, ma'am. That is the language of a slush fund. He wasn't finished. But the story gets worse. After your affair was exposed and you finalized your divorce from your brother, you married Mr. Minot in March of 2020. One might assume that, to avoid the appearance of impropriety, you would cease paying your new husband from your campaign account. But you did the opposite. He slid a new FEC summary across the table. In the 2020 election cycle alone, your campaign paid Mr. Minot's firm an additional $1.6 million. In total, your campaign funneled nearly $3 million to your lover, and then husband, a man whose primary qualification, it seems, was his romantic involvement with you. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across the committee members. Now, I may be just a simple country lawyer, but I've read the federal statutes. Using campaign contributions to enrich oneself or one's spouse is not just unethical. It is a felony known as conversion of campaign funds for personal use. You didn't just have an affair, Congresswoman. You had your donors, people who gave you $10, $20, $50 believing they were supporting a cause, pay for it. You used their idealism to fund your infidelity. The moral weight of the accusation was crushing. It was a betrayal not just of the law, but of the very people who had empowered her. The Southern gentleman had just exposed her as not only a fraud, but a thief who stole from her own believers. But your abuse of campaign funds wasn't limited to financing your romantic life, Kennedy continued, his voice a relentless drumbeat of accusation. He seamlessly transitioned from one scandal to the next, giving his target no time to recover, no space to breathe. The pile of evidence in front of him seemed to have no bottom. It appears you treated your campaign account less like a sacred trust and more like a personal slush fund for any inconvenient expense that arose. He pulled a new document from his folder. Let's discuss the findings of the Minnesota Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board. This isn't a partisan attack, ma'am. This is a judgment from an independent oversight body in your own state. In 2019, they found you guilty of illegally using campaign funds for personal travel and other non-campaign expenses. He held up the official ruling, but it's the details that are most revealing. The board found that you used $1,500 in campaign money to pay for your personal tax preparer. And what specific tax services did you require? You needed to file amended returns to correct the fraudulent joint filings we discussed earlier, the ones where you claimed to be married to a man who was not your husband. Let's be very clear about this, he said, his voice laced with incredulity. You committed tax fraud, and when you were caught, you used your donor's money to pay the accountant to clean up your mess. That is a level of audacity one rarely sees outside of organized crime. He didn't stop there, but my personal favorite item from the board's report is this one. He produced a copy of a check. This is a payment of several $1,000s from your campaign account to your divorce attorney. And which divorce was this for? This was to finalize your legal separation from Mr. Elmy, your brother, the sham marriage you entered into for immigration purposes. So, to recap the timeline of corruption, your donor's money was used to pay for the lawyer to end your fraudulent marriage to your brother, so that you would be free to marry your lover, whose company you were also funding with millions of dollars in campaign cash. It is a breathtakingly cynical cycle of fraud, paid for by the very people you claim to represent. The few remaining progressive activists in the gallery began to file out, their faces a mixture of shame and disgust. The solidarity hijabs they had worn with such pride at the beginning of the day were now being quietly tucked into pockets and purses. The abandonment was nearly complete. But the grift, it seems, did not end with your own campaign, Kennedy said, his tone shifting to one of even greater gravity. He opened a fresh section of his folder. Let's talk about your husband's latest business venture. Are you familiar with a company called the North Side Wine Group, Congresswoman? Omar's face, already a canvas of despair, went completely white. It was a look of pure terror, the reaction of someone who knew the final, most devastating secret was about to be revealed. I have no role in my husband's private business affairs, she stated, her voice a near whisper. No role. Well, allow me to refresh your memory, Kennedy said, his gaze shifting to the public gallery. Mr. Name Mohammed, would you please rise? A distinguished-looking man in his late 50s, his face etched with anger and betrayal, stood up. All eyes in the room turned to him. Mr. Mohammed, Kennedy said, his voice gentle but projecting throughout the room, could you please tell the committee how much money you invested in Mr. Minot's North Side Wine Group? $300,000, the man said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. It was my family's life savings, my children's college fund. And what were you promised in return for that investment? Kennedy asked. I was promised that my investment would triple in 2 years, Mr. Mohammed replied. Tim Minot told me that with his wife, a sitting United States Congresswoman, as a partner, the company was guaranteed to succeed. He told me her position would secure lucrative government contracts for receptions and events. He used her name, her office, to get my money. And have you seen any return on your investment, Mr. Mohammed? Not a single penny, the man said, his voice breaking. It's been 3 years. The money is gone. I later discovered that just weeks after I gave him my savings, he and Congresswoman Omar purchased a $1.3 million townhouse here in Washington, D.C. They bought their mansion with my children's future. That's a lie, Omar shouted, a primal scream of denial. But Mr. Mohammed shouted back, his grief and anger finally boiling over. No, the lie was the fake inventory reports you showed me. The lie was the promise of a winery that never existed. You were at the meetings. You smiled and told me it was a wonderful opportunity. You knew. Security officers moved toward the man, but Kennedy waved them off. Let him speak. He is the victim here. Thank you, Mr. Mohammed, Kennedy said softly after the man had finished. You may be seated. He turned his cold gaze back to Omar. You claim you had no involvement, but you were present at the meetings. And more than that, you directly profited from the scheme. He produced one final document. This is your own Congressional Financial Disclosure Form for last year. On it, you declare spousal income from the North Side Wine Group in the range of $100,001 to $1 million. You personally profited from your husband's fraudulent enterprise, ma'am. Under federal law, that makes you an accessory. It makes you part of a conspiracy to commit wire fraud. One of Omar's lawyers leaped to his feet. Senator, you are making baseless allegations. This is character assassination. Baseless, Kennedy retorted, his voice like steel. He held up a final paper. This is a civil lawsuit filed yesterday in D.C. Superior Court by Mr. Mohammed and two other victims, suing you and your husband for racketeering. And this, he added, is a confirmation that the FBI's white-collar crime division has opened a formal investigation into the matter. Does that sound baseless to you, counselor? The lawyer sank back into his chair, defeated. Kennedy methodically organized the papers before him. So let's summarize. You used campaign funds to conduct an affair. You funneled millions in donor money to your lover-turned-husband. You used campaign funds to clean up your tax fraud. And you personally profited from an investment scheme that defrauded innocent people of their life savings. You haven't just broken the law, Congresswoman. You have built a career on a foundation of lies and theft. As the shock of the fraud allegations settled, a new, more somber mood descended upon the hearing room. The atmosphere shifted from that of a legal proceeding to something more akin to a tribunal on character and ethics. Kennedy's demeanor changed with it. The faint, mocking smile that had accompanied his dissection of her finances vanished, replaced by an expression of stern gravity. He looked at Omar, who seemed to have physically shrunken in her chair, and his voice took on a weight it had not possessed before. We have spent the last hour, ma'am, documenting a truly staggering pattern of financial corruption, he began, his voice low and resonant. But I am afraid we must now turn to a subject that is, in many ways, even more disturbing. We must discuss your repeated, public statements regarding the Jewish people and the State of Israel. These are not mere policy disagreements, Congresswoman. They represent a pattern of rhetoric so consistently venomous that it calls into question your very fitness to hold public office. He reached into his folder and pulled out a printed screenshot of a tweet. Let us begin with February of 2019. In response to criticism of your positions, you tweeted to the world, "It's all about the Benjamin's baby," a clear reference to $100 bills. When a journalist asked you to clarify who you believed was paying American politicians to be pro-Israel, you replied with one word, AIPAC. Do you recall this? Omar's remaining lawyer whispered to her, and she nodded faintly. I issued an apology for that tweet. Yes, you did, Kennedy conceded, after the leadership of your own party publicly condemned your words. But an apology forced by political pressure does not erase the poison of the original sentiment. You invoked one of the oldest, most pernicious anti-Semitic tropes in existence, the idea that a shadowy cabal of Jews uses money to manipulate governments and control the world. It is a lie that has been used for centuries to justify persecution and violence. He paused, letting the historical weight of his words fill the silence. And it was not an isolated incident, was it? It was part of a deeply ingrained pattern. He produced another document. But before we review your other public statements, let's examine what you say in private when you think no one is listening. Kennedy's thin smile made a brief, chilling return. We have managed to obtain records of some of your deleted social media posts. This one is from a Somali language forum just a few weeks before your Benjamin's comment. He held up the printout. You wrote, and I translate, the Jewish lobby owns the American Congress. They buy and sell politicians like cattle at a market. It is time to expose the puppet masters. You deleted this post within an hour, but not before it was archived. The phrase puppet masters landed like a physical blow. Several members of the committee audibly gasped. It was a direct echo of the most vile propaganda of the 20th century. Puppet masters, Kennedy repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. Another classic, textbook anti-Semitic caricature. The Jew as the secret manipulator, pulling the strings of power from behind the curtain. But perhaps, again, this was just a poor choice of words from someone new to the national stage. He then reached for a small digital audio recorder. So let's listen to your words at a private fundraising dinner in your own district in March 2019. A donor in the room was so appalled by your rhetoric that they made this recording. He pressed the play button. Omar's own voice, confident and clear, filled the chamber. I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it is okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country. The recording continued. I want to ask, why is it okay for me to talk about the influence of the NRA, of fossil fuel industries or big pharma, and not talk about a powerful lobby that is pushing for a foreign country? When the recording stopped, Kennedy looked at her, his eyes cold. The accusation of allegiance to a foreign country, dual loyalty. You stood before your supporters and accused your Jewish American colleagues in the United States Congress of being traitors. You suggested their allegiance is not to the United States Constitution, which they swore an oath to defend, but to Israel. This is not a policy critique, Congresswoman. It is one of the most dangerous and historically loaded accusations one can make, used for generations to paint Jewish citizens as untrustworthy, foreign, and other. That was taken out of context, Omar protested, her voice cracking. The context makes it worse, not better, Kennedy shot back, his voice rising for the first time. The context was a speech in which you repeatedly singled out Jewish influence as uniquely sinister. The context is a career of singling out the world's only Jewish state for condemnation, while consorting with its most violent enemies. Two of the most senior Jewish Democrats on the committee, men who had served in Congress for decades, quietly stood up and, without looking at Omar, walked out of the room. One of them was visibly shaking his head in disgust. Their silent departure was a more powerful condemnation than any words could have been. The moral authority of her own party was abandoning her in real time. Let's move forward in the timeline of your rhetoric, Kennedy pressed on, his pace accelerating. The methodical presentation of evidence was building a powerful, damning momentum. In June of 2021, you issued a tweet that placed the United States and Israel in the same category as Hamas and the Taliban, accusing all four of unthinkable atrocities. You created a moral equivalency between two democratic nations, with established legal systems and rules of military engagement, and two of the most barbaric terrorist organizations on the planet. I was calling for universal accountability, Omar said weakly, reciting a prepackaged talking point that now sounded utterly hollow. Were you? Kennedy countered, his voice sharp with disbelief. Were you truly unable to see a difference between the United States military and the Taliban, who harbored the architects of 9/11 and stoned women to death in soccer stadiums? Were you unable to distinguish between the Israeli Defense Forces and Hamas, a designated terrorist group whose founding charter calls for the murder of every Jew on earth? The only common thread between the entities you condemned is that they are all opposed by radical Islamic extremists. Is that why you grouped them together, Congresswoman? Was this an act of moral confusion or an act of deliberate ideological alignment? He did not wait for an answer she could not give. Instead, he pivoted, connecting her rhetoric to her associations and funding. Since you are so concerned with malign foreign influence, let's discuss your own. Are you familiar with the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR? They are a respected civil rights organization, she replied automatically. They are an unindicted co-conspirator in the largest terrorism financing trial in American history, Kennedy retorted, citing the Holy Land Foundation case. According to the FBI and federal prosecutors, CAIR was founded as a front organization by members of the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, and this is the group you have chosen as your primary platform. He produced a series of photographs, displaying them for the committee. Here you are, the guest of honor at a CAIR fundraising banquet in 2018. Here you are again in 2019, delivering the keynote address. And again in 2020. At each event, you delivered speeches attacking Israel and questioning the loyalty of your Jewish colleagues. And at each event, you helped them raise hundreds of thousands of dollars. Isn't it interesting, he said, sliding a new financial summary into view, that a significant portion of the funds raised at these events found their way into your own campaign coffers via bundled donations? You attacked Jewish political influence while taking money from an organization founded by terrorist sympathizers. The hypocrisy was stark, a glaring contradiction that left no room for defense. But your associations go beyond just CAIR, Kennedy continued, his voice growing harder. He pulled out a set of documents bearing the letterhead of the U.S. State Department. In 2017, during a trip abroad, you held meetings with several charitable organizations. The problem is that these specific charities have been formally designated by the United States Treasury Department as fundraising fronts for terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. You were formally warned by the American Embassy not to attend these meetings. Your response was to accuse our diplomats of Islamophobia and hold the meetings anyway. He then produced another, even more damning document. And this is perhaps the most direct link. These are financial records showing that in 2019 and 2020, your campaign accepted substantial donations from individuals who sit on the board of the American affiliate of the Qatar Foundation. He paused, letting the name register. This is the same Qatar that hosts the international leadership of Hamas in luxurious villas. The same Qatar that has funneled billions of dollars to Hamas's military wing. You publicly decry the influence of the Benjamins in American politics, while privately taking money from the bagmen of a terror-sponsoring state. How do you reconcile that, Congresswoman? Those were legal donations from American citizens, she stammered. The hypocrisy is breathtaking, Kennedy stated flatly, ignoring her protest. You accuse American Jews of dual loyalty while you take money from the representatives of a foreign government that funds terrorism. You claim to be a champion of human rights while equating democratic nations with the very terrorists who throw gay men from rooftops and use children as human shields. He pulled out one final item from this section, a large, high-resolution photograph. This is from a trip you took in 2019. In it, you are seen smiling, warmly shaking the hand of a man named Mahmoud al-Zahar. He looked up. For those who don't know, Mr. al-Zahar is not just a politician. He is a co-founder of Hamas. A man who has publicly called for the destruction of Israel and celebrated suicide bombings against civilians. The Israeli government and our own State Department protested this meeting. You dismissed their concerns as an attempt to silence you. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage of her credibility. The pattern is undeniable, ma'am. This is not legitimate criticism of policy. You consistently invoke the most ancient and hateful anti-Semitic tropes. You question the patriotism of your own Jewish American colleagues. You take money from and meet with the supporters and members of designated terrorist organizations. Your own Jewish colleagues on this very committee have tried to educate you, to warn you, to beg you to stop. And each time, you offer a hollow, politically forced apology, and then you double down. Because this is not born of ignorance, Congresswoman. It is born of a deep and abiding hatred. The few remaining supporters in the gallery were utterly silent, their faces etched with the painful realization that they had been defending the indefensible. But we are not finished, Kennedy announced, his voice dropping to a somber, almost funereal tone as he reached for the final, thickest section of his folder. Because all of these threads, the fraud, the corruption, the hatred, they all weave together in your most infamous and revealing statement of all, the one that exposes to the world who you truly are. He paused, his eyes locking on hers with an intensity that made her flinch. Let's talk about why you described the attacks of September 11th as simply, some people did something. The entire atmosphere of the hearing room underwent a final, profound transformation. The political theater fell away, replaced by the hallowed, somber air of a memorial. Kennedy's voice, when he spoke again, was devoid of all theatricality, all Southern charm. It was the cold, precise voice of a prosecutor laying out the details of a capital crime. He turned his gaze from Omar to the front row of the gallery, where a small, quiet group of men and women sat. They wore no political slogans, but many clutched faded photographs or wore small pins bearing the faces of lost loved ones. Before I proceed, Kennedy said, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room, I want to acknowledge the families of the victims of September 11th who have joined us today. I know that what we are about to discuss is profoundly painful, but it is a discussion the nation must hear. He turned back to Omar, who now looked not just defeated but terrified. In March of 2019, Congresswoman, you delivered a speech at a fundraising event for CAIR. The organization we have already established was founded by Hamas sympathizers. And in that speech, you uttered a phrase so callous, so dismissive, that it sent a shockwave of grief and anger across our nation. He gestured to the large screens on the committee room wall. Let's play the clip in its entirety, so there can be no claims of it being taken out of context. Omar's lawyers began to rise, but the Democratic chairman, his face a grim mask, waved them down. The video played. Omar's image appeared on the screen standing at a podium. Her voice, amplified by the speakers, filled the room. CAIR was founded after 9/11, she said, because they recognized that some people did something, and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties. Kennedy froze, the frame on her face. Some people did something, he repeated, the words dropping like stones into the silent room. That is your description for the coordinated hijacking of 4 commercial airliners, for the deliberate murder of 2,977 innocent men, women, and children, not Al-Qaeda terrorists, not a vicious attack on America, just some people did something, as if it were a minor traffic accident, a trivial event not worthy of specific condemnation. He let the words hang in the air, a monument to her callousness. But perhaps, he continued, that was a momentary lapse, a poor choice of words under pressure, except the evidence shows this is not an outlier but the core of your actual beliefs. He produced a new document. This is a transcript from a Minnesota public radio interview you gave in 2013, long before you were a household name. When asked about the 9/11 attacks, you said, and I quote, "We have to understand the grievances that led to the retaliation. America's actions in the Middle East have consequences." I was explaining root causes, Omar interjected, her voice thin and reedy. Were you explaining or were you justifying? Kennedy shot back. He held up another printout, this one of a deleted social media post. On the anniversary of the attacks, September 11, 2013, you posted on a private online forum in Somali. The American obsession with 9/11 is overwrought. They use it as an excuse to bomb our people. You dismissed the single greatest loss of life on American soil as an obsession. A man in the front row, clutching a photograph of a young woman in a firefighter's uniform, stood up, his body trembling with a rage he could no longer contain. "My daughter ran into that tower," he roared, his voice cracking with grief. "She wasn't overwrought, she was saving people." Kennedy raised a hand gently. "Sir, I understand your pain. Please let me finish. The world needs to hear all of it." He turned his icy gaze back to Omar. "But even that is not the most contemptible part, because we have obtained your private communications from after your 'some people did something' comment became a national scandal." He held up a set of authenticated printed screenshots. "These are from a private WhatsApp group chat with other political activists. In it, you wrote, 'The American guilt over 9/11 is a powerful weapon. We must use it. Every time they criticize us, we must bring up their Islamophobia and discrimination after the attacks, make them defensive, make them feel ashamed of their reaction, not of the event itself." The room erupted. It was the sound of a final moral boundary being crossed. Even the most cynical political operatives in the room looked shocked. One of Omar's own staff members stood up, took off her security badge, placed it on her empty chair, and walked out of the room. "Use their guilt against them," Kennedy repeated, his voice filled with a cold disgust. "You viewed the murder of nearly 3,000 of your fellow citizens not as a national tragedy, but as a political opportunity, a tool for manipulation, a lever to be pulled to silence criticism." He was not done. "It gets worse. This is from the FBI's report during your background check for a security clearance. When agents questioned you about your views on terrorism, you told them, and this is a direct quote from their report, 'American foreign policy is the real terrorism.' 9/11 was a case of the chickens coming home to roost. You told federal agents to their faces that America deserved to be attacked." Several of the uniformed Capitol police officers standing guard along the walls of the room took an involuntary step forward, their faces hardening into masks of fury. These were men and women whose colleagues had died on that day, and on January 6th, defending the very institution this woman now served in. The FBI agents, Kennedy noted, recommended against granting you a security clearance, stating in their report, "Subject displays a disturbing sympathy for anti-American ideologies and an inability to condemn terrorism without equivocation. But the political leadership of your party overruled the security professionals." He pulled out one last, devastating document. "This is a public statement released this morning by Imam Abdullah Ansari, one of the most respected Muslim clerics in your own district. He writes, I have counseled Congresswoman Omar for years about her dangerous rhetoric. Her minimization of 9/11 brings shame upon our entire community of Muslim Americans who love this country and who died on that day. She does not speak for Islam. She speaks only for her own ambition and her own deep-seated hatred. Your own spiritual leaders, Kennedy said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, are disowning you. He finally rose to his feet, a towering figure of moral authority. Representative Omar, thousands of Americans died on 9/11. They were Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and non-believers. Among the dead were dozens of proud Muslim Americans, including first responders who charged into those burning towers to save their fellow citizens. You dishonor their sacrifice every time you refuse to name their killers for what they were, terrorists. He looked at the 9/11 families, his voice thick with emotion. These families have waited 2 decades for justice, for peace, for the simple human decency of having their loss respected. And you, a member of the United States Congress, paid by their tax dollars, sit here and call the murder of their children, their spouses, their parents, something that some people did. This is not about politics. Kennedy's voice thundered through the chamber, rising with a righteous anger that seemed to shake the very walls. He was no longer a senator questioning a witness. He was a patriot defending the honor of his nation. This is not about left versus right or Democrat versus Republican. This is about a fundamental standard of human decency. It is about whether a person who cannot bring herself to condemn the mass murder of Americans, who sees our national trauma as a political tool to be exploited, who consorts with and takes money from the supporters of terrorism, whether such a person has any right to hold a position of trust and power in this country. He paused, taking a deep breath, and then delivered the final, institutional blow. He held up a single sheet of paper. This memorandum was delivered to the committee chairman's office not 10 minutes ago. It is from the Director of National Intelligence. He read from it, his voice ringing with finality. Based on the overwhelming evidence of foreign entanglements, questionable loyalties, and sympathy for anti-American rhetoric presented in today's hearing, the security clearance for Representative Ilhan Omar is hereby immediately and indefinitely suspended, pending a full and complete investigation. It's over, ma'am. You are no longer deemed trustworthy to possess our nation's secrets. Omar's lawyers leaped to their feet, shouting objections, citing procedure and precedent, but their voices were lost in the tidal wave of consequence. Furthermore, Kennedy continued, his voice cutting through the noise like a razor, I have been informed that the Department of Justice will be opening a formal criminal investigation into the matters of immigration fraud and conspiracy. The IRS will be pursuing the tax fraud. The Federal Election Commission will be investigating the conversion of campaign funds. And the House Ethics Committee, he said, looking directly at the chairman, will be launching an immediate inquiry into all of the above, with a view to recommending a formal censure or expulsion. He sat back down, the energy seeming to drain from him, the prosecutor's work now done. Your career in this chamber is over, Congresswoman, not because of your race or your religion or your country of origin, but because your character has been found wanting, because you are a fraud, a grifter, and a purveyor of hatred who managed, through a series of lies, to climb to one of the highest offices in the land. The committee room descended into utter chaos. Republicans were on their feet, calling for an immediate vote of expulsion. The few remaining Democrats were in panicked huddles, desperately trying to distance themselves from the political black hole that Omar had become. In the center of the storm, Ilhan Omar made one last, futile attempt to save herself. She rose shakily, her face a twisted mask of rage and disbelief. This is a witch hunt, she screamed, her voice cracking. This is McCarthyism. You are doing this because I am a strong, proud Muslim woman who refuses to be silenced. Kennedy looked at her, his expression now one of weary sadness. Ma'am, he said, his voice once again quiet, Joseph McCarthy's evil was that he made accusations without evidence. I have here, he gestured to the mountain of paper on the table, over 100 separate pieces of evidence. Sworn affidavits, authenticated government records, financial statements, audio and video recordings. This is not McCarthyism. This is the meticulous application of fact. This is called accountability. He then picked up his phone. And it seems your colleagues agree. The room quieted instantly. A statement has just been released by the Congressional Progressive Caucus, signed by its chairwoman, Representative Pramila Jayapal. It reads, "The evidence presented today is deeply disturbing and cannot be ignored. While we cherish vigorous debate, we cannot and will not defend corruption or anti-Semitism. We are suspending Representative Omar from the caucus, effective immediately." Omar gasped, stumbling backward as if struck. "And here is another," Kennedy continued, scrolling on his phone. "From the Congressional Black Caucus, integrity is the bedrock of public service. The allegations against Representative Omar are of the most serious nature and betray the trust of her constituents and our community. We call upon her to resign. Her allies, her shields, her entire political ecosystem, all of it was dissolving in real time." The chairman, his face ashen, finally addressed her directly. "Representative Omar, in light of this evidence and these statements from your own colleagues, do you have anything to say in your defense?" She stared at him wildly, her eyes darting around the room, searching for a single friendly face and finding none. "This is all lies," she shrieked. "Fabricated, forged. I am the victim here." "Ma'am," the chairman interrupted, his patience finally exhausted. "I have seen the evidence. The documents are real. The recordings are verified. As chairman of this committee, I am joining the call for your immediate resignation from the United States Congress." The finality of his words was absolute. It was over. At that moment, as if on cue, two uniformed Capitol police officers entered the room and approached her table. "Representative Omar," one said, his voice polite but firm, "we have been instructed to escort you from the premises. Your security credentials have been deactivated." The sight was stunning. A sitting member of Congress being led from a hearing room like a common trespasser. She turned one last time, her face contorted with a venomous rage. "This isn't over," she screamed at Kennedy. "You will not destroy me." Kennedy, who was calmly packing his documents into his briefcase, did not even look up. "It is over, ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You destroyed yourself. We were all just here to watch." The destruction of Ilhan Omar was not a slow political decline. It was a sudden, catastrophic collapse, like a condemned building imploding upon its own rotten foundation. Within hours of her being escorted from the hearing room, the political world she had so carefully constructed ceased to exist. By late afternoon, the Speaker of the House, who had for years protected her from the consequences of her rhetoric, issued a terse, one-sentence statement. "The integrity of the House must be preserved. Representative Omar should resign." It was the final nail in her political coffin. Her own party leadership had officially cut her loose. The fallout in her home state of Minnesota was even more swift and brutal. The governor, a fellow Democrat, announced that he would call for a special election the moment her seat was vacated. Her most recent primary challenger, who had come within a few percentage points of defeating her, stood before a crowd of reporters on the steps of the Minneapolis City Hall. "Today, a great stain has been removed from our community," he declared. "We deserve a representative who builds bridges, not one who burns them. We deserve honesty, not fraud. We deserve a patriot, not a purveyor of hate. Our long nightmare is over." Protesters, many of them Somali Americans who had once been her proudest supporters, gathered outside her now shuttered district office. Their signs were not the adoring placards of the morning, but handwritten messages of betrayal. "Fraud is not our culture. You do not speak for us. Honor the USA." Imam Abdullah Ansari, whose statement Kennedy had read, led a public prayer for healing and for the restoration of their community's good name. The legal consequences descended with breathtaking speed. The U.S. Attorney's Office formally announced a multi-agency federal task force to investigate what they termed a broad conspiracy involving immigration fraud, tax evasion, and illegal campaign finance activities. Her husband, Tim Minot, was arrested by FBI agents at his D.C. townhouse, the same one purchased with investors' money and charged with multiple counts of wire fraud and racketeering. He was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief. As night fell on Washington, Omar herself remained unseen, holed up with the few lawyers who hadn't abandoned her. A final, defiant statement was released to the press. "I am the victim of a coordinated smear campaign," it read. "I will fight these baseless allegations and I will be vindicated. I will never resign." But the words were meaningless, a ghost screaming into a hurricane. She had no allies left. The progressive media outlets that had once championed her were now running long, soul-searching segments on how her corruption had damaged the movement. On social media, the hashtags Omar fraud and Kennedy was right trended globally for 12 straight hours. The most poignant reactions came from the 9/11 families. The father who had shouted in the hearing room gave a tearful interview on the Capitol lawn. "For 20 years," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we have had to listen to people diminish what happened to us, what was stolen from us. Today, someone finally stood up and spoke the truth. It felt like justice." Senator John Kennedy, the architect of this historic reckoning, eschewed the triumphant press conferences and cable news interviews. He was found late that evening by a local reporter, sitting on the quiet porch of his home in Louisiana, looking out at the placid waters of the bayou as the sun went down. He seemed not triumphant, but weary. "There is no joy in this," he said, his voice a low, thoughtful drawl. "Watching a life implode, even a life built on such deceit, is a sad thing. But the body politic, like any living thing, sometimes develops a sickness, an infection, and if you don't treat it, it will spread. Today we had to perform a painful but necessary surgery." When asked if he had any regrets, he paused for a long moment. "My only regret," he said softly, "is that it took so long, that so many people had to be hurt by her words and her actions before the system finally held her to account. We should have been more vigilant." The reporter asked what he thought would happen next. Kennedy smiled faintly. "Well, I imagine the good people of Minneapolis will choose a new representative soon, someone worthy of their trust. As for me," he said, gesturing toward the darkening water, "the sun will rise tomorrow and there will be more work to do. Corruption, like the tide, never truly stops. You just have to keep watch." He looked out at the last sliver of orange on the horizon. That woman was given every gift this country has to offer: refuge, safety, opportunity, a voice in our highest councils. And she repaid that generosity with contempt and criminality. But in the end, the truth came out. The system, for all its flaws, worked. That's the America I believe in. That's the America that will always endure. As the screen fades to black on the image of the quiet, resolute senator, one final truth remains. A battle for the soul of American integrity had been fought, not with bombs or bullets, but with facts in a folder. And on that day, a Southern gentleman armed with nothing but the truth had proven that character still matters, that justice is not just a word, and that accountability, though sometimes delayed, will eventually come for us all. The reckoning was final. The reckoning was complete. If you believe that truth and accountability are worth fighting for, smash that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this story so that no one ever forgets the day the fox outsmarted the wolf.